Hello, folks. It's Bradley J., The Bradley J. Show with Rich Rubino, a political historian and author of, show him the book. It's a political trivia book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. Love that. Want to get that in there because a lot of folks don't stay around that long. This was scheduled before the Trump indictment came down. The primary topic today is Chris Christie. Chris Christie says, and I think there might be something to it, that he's the only guy that can stand on a debate stage and go toe to toe with Donald Trump and take the withering assault that Donald Trump is going to lay down upon anybody that tries to stand up to him at a debate stage and even fire some salvos back. I think there might be something to that. I don't know what to think about Chris Christie. You know, there was the bridge controversy, but in the big picture, that doesn't look like so much anymore compared to what controversies we've had. And I don't know what was even proven with that. So there you go. You have there you go. You have a conservative. Well, you have a Republican and somebody that's, kind of good natured and doesn't seem to be a nut job, and maybe is the kind of guy who could stand up to Trump. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting about Chris Christie specifically. So Chris Christie gets elected governor of New Jersey, kind of an establishment type center-right Republican. And when he gets in there, he actually becomes a darling. This is his first term as governor, becomes a darling of conservatives. In part because if you see him ever, and this is all rhetorical flourish, if you will, when he would go to town hall meetings, for example, when somebody would criticize him, he'd really kind of go after him. He would excoriate that person. And as a result, folks like Rush Limbaugh really kind of gravitated to him. And the thought was, this was after he had been elected governor. New Jersey's kind of weird because they off-year elections, meaning that most people are elected in even years. In New Jersey's case, he was elected in an odd year. Automatically, there are polls showing him as the preponderant frontrunner for the presidential nomination in 2012. And he'd just been elected governor of New Jersey. He said at the time, short of suicide, I don't know what I can do to prove to you that I'm not going to run for president. And he didn't run for president. But the point was the conservatives really loved him, even though he was a Northeasterner and he was certainly not the most conservative Republican in the country. Then 2012 rolls around, and certainly you had a storm about a week before the election. He kind of embraced Barack Obama, if you remember, and that happened. That kind of many conservatives kind of became standoffish toward him after that. But the thing about 2012 was, interestingly, politics is all about timing. If you think about it, if Barack Obama, he's elected in 2004, if he had not run for president in 2008, he probably would have been seen as a creature of the United States Senate and not kind of an avant-garde politician. Perhaps 2008 when he ran for president was the only time he probably could have won. Jimmy Carter in 1976, country was looking for somebody from outside of politics. He said, I'm quote unquote untainted by Washington. 2012 was Chris Christie's year. That was the year that conservatives were gravitating toward him. And the fact that he's from New Jersey and he'd been elected as governor of New Jersey showed that he could get elected in a blue state. He didn't do it in 2012. So instead, he gets reelected as governor in 2013. By 2016, he was running for the nomination, and he's just essentially another candidate because the Republicans had kind of gone cold on him. So he runs in 2016, gets nowhere, comes in about sixth place, comes in behind Marco Rubio. But one thing he did do in that debate, in that primary, is he essentially took out Marco Rubio. Now, Marco Rubio was one of the earlier kind of front-runner candidates. He was somebody who had got elected to the Senate in Florida by being a Tea Party type candidate in 2010. In 2016, in one of the debates, Marco Rubio was essentially robotic. No matter what the question is, he would say, the notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is false. Barack Obama knows exactly what he is doing. And Chris Christie went after him, basically saying, you're like a robot. Someone told you this is what you're supposed to say, and you're supposed to say that, and you just keep saying it over and over again ad nauseum. And then Marco Rubio later says it again in the debate. So the point is, he's really good at taking people down, just like Elizabeth Warren took down Michael Bloomberg in 2020.
So Marco Rubio would say, Chris Christie said, there's the same 25-word speech that he memorized.
Yes.
And that's all he can do.
Yes, and Marco Rubio, all of a sudden, he was the emperor without any clothes. All of a sudden, Marco Rubio, who some Republicans thought of as their great savior, thought this guy is from a swing state. He just got elected. This guy is going to be our nominee in 2016. Now all of a sudden they see him almost like the Democrats started to see John Edwards as somebody who's just kind of robotic, who people take, memorize this, stay on message, no matter what the question is. If they ask who your favorite hockey team is, say, the notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is a fiction. Barack Obama knows exactly what he is doing. And then in New Hampshire, there was a robot that would walk around. It would be called the Marco Rubio robot. The Marco Rubio robot would walk around saying that. The point is he was basically done after Chris Christie did that. But in 2020, when Chris Christie ran again, he was not able to do that to Donald Trump. He was up on the debate stage. Remember, he was one of a litany of other candidates, 17 other candidates. Well, you had kind of you had the big debate and the small debate. And in the big debate, he was there. And he was essentially another candidate. He was not able to take down Donald Trump. So he drops out of the race early and he endorses Donald Trump. He was one of the first establishment figures to endorse Donald Trump. He would campaign with Donald Trump. And then he was actually on the short list for Donald Trump as a running mate. It came down to essentially him, Newt Gingrich, and Mike Pence. And Donald Trump was persuaded to choose Mike Pence because he had a little bit of a void, if you will, with the religious right. And the thought was, well, Mike Pence is a social conservative. He was from the religious right. So he plucks Mike Pence, who was running for re-election of Indiana, had about a 50% chance of losing over Chris Christie. And Chris Christie is an early supporter. And then Chris Christie essentially left the reservation. So if I'm Donald Trump in that debate, what I'm going to be saying is essentially, Chris, he says, I beat you in that election in 2016, and then you started to run it. You decided you were going to hitch your wagon to me. You became extremely unpopular in New Jersey, and this is true after Bridgegate and his presidential run. He was literally had a job approval rating of under 20% in the state of New Jersey. A guy who had been reelected with almost 60% of the vote. By the end of his term, his job approval rating is about 20%. He's extremely unpopular. So Donald Trump can look at him and say, basically, you're a loser. You could never get elected anything. You couldn't get elected dog catcher in the state of New Jersey. So essentially, now you're coming. So essentially, you come to me, you hitch your wagon. I don't choose you as vice president. Still, I choose that other loser over there, Mike Pence. So now you're going to come after me. And that's essentially what Donald Trump will say to him. And then Chris Christie, who has nothing to lose now because he probably doesn't have any other elective office, will go back ever to run for, is going to go after Donald Trump. It's going to be one of the ugliest debates you're ever going to see. In the meantime, Donald Trump's got other candidates he's going to be running against that are former allies. Perhaps Mike Pence, his former vice president, Nikki Haley, his former UN ambassador, is already in the race. Mike Pompeo, his former Secretary of State, is potentially in the race. John Bolton, could potentially be in this race. This is going to be fascinating. It's going to be Donald Trump against all of his former allies and maybe Lynn Cheney.
Does Mike Pence have any kind of chance? Because no one likes him really, because the Trump people feel like he let him down, and of course on the left they don't like him. He does have the religious right, I guess, but he's not really a player, right?
I think he has a very low ceiling. Religious right is going. There are going to be some factions of the religious right that are going to be with him, but the majority of the religious right is not going to be with him. They're going to be with his former boss instead, probably Donald Trump, because they may not like whatever they think of Donald Trump personally. He did give them the judges. And the fact of the matter is that Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Dobbs decision, and that was kind of their flagship issue. So they may give some lip service and say we like Mike Pence, but my guess is that Mike Pence really does not really. Mike Pence probably drops out after Iowa.
How about Nikki Haley? Same thing. I mean, not same thing, but she's a
little bit different. She's a little bit different because she's somebody that actually can be charismatic, can be inspiring when she speaks. And she's somebody who can make the case. What I would say if I were her, I would say because she had been governor. She said, I'm a governor with national security experience, meaning many governors. And this is where she goes after Ron DeSantis. Say many governors, for example, have never had any foreign policy experience. I have because I've been a UN ambassador. And she can also say essentially, I agree with much of Donald Trump's America First agenda, but I don't have the adjacent baggage that Donald Trump has, and that's going to be the case she can make. So I can actually see a scenario where she actually garners a nomination.
How about really? How about Pompeo?
I mean, I don't think she's the front runner. I think she's certainly a wild card in many respects, and certainly an underdog. But I can see a scenario from Mike Pence. I cannot see that scenario. And by the way, in New Hampshire is one of the most, even in the Republican Party, New Hampshire is one of the most secular states in the country. That's why folks like Mike Huckabee, who won Iowa, or Rick Santorum, who won Iowa, basically on the with the evangelical base of the Republican Party, go off to New Hampshire. They lose miserably in New Hampshire, and then their candidacies never really pick up the steam they had after that. So New Hampshire is a very secular state, even within the Republican Party. That's why I don't see. I think if Mike Pence, even if he outperforms in Iowa, he's going to do miserable in New Hampshire. I think Mike Pompeo. I don't know what his base constituency is right now. He's a former Secretary of State, former congressman from Kansas. Trump, took him and made him Secretary of State. I don't see where he has necessarily any form of a base. I don't see where there's the Mike Pompeo base is. He's at 0% right now. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. Jimmy Carter was at 0% in this time in 1975, and he landed up garnering the nomination based on hard work. But I don't see where, as I say, I don't see where his natural bloodline of a constituency is. But maybe he's the type of person who can get a lot of money and from well-heeled benefactors, and during the debates, maybe he can outperform. But right now, I don't see it.
What about Ted Cruz? He was a
Yeah.
fairly well-known person who seemed to have aspirations, but he seemed to become a complete Donald Trump bootlicker. He would never run while Donald Trump's running, right?
No. Assuming he's going to keep his word. No, he said that he would not run, and he also is up for re-election in 2024. Now, actually, there's a law in Texas called the LBJ law, and they made this in 1960 when Lyndon Johnson wanted to run for re-election in the Senate and run for president. Texas legislature, very sympathetic toward him, passed a law allowing you to run for both offices. Subsequently, Phil Graham's done that. Ron Paul's done that. So you can run for two offices at once in Texas. But my guess is he's going to do the same thing Elizabeth Warren's going to do in Massachusetts, going to run for re-election, try to be a figure from the United States Senate, as opposed to taking this risk of potentially running for president and essentially being one of, 11 or 12 other people up there. And I think most of the people who are for Ted Cruz in the primary in 2020, in 2016, are now Trump accolades. So I don't see where his natural constituency is beyond a few people who maybe think that Trump maybe who think Trump is almost too establishment, if that's possible.
So speaking of Elizabeth Warren, did you see where she's working together with Josh Hawley on some banking regulation legislation?
She does that a lot. She actually does that a lot. She's worked with Chuck Grassley, for example, a very conservative senator from Iowa, on bringing down the prices of hearing aids. She actually it's funny, she's very much on the left, but she can pick a few issues where she can work with Republicans. And in terms of what she's doing with Josh Hawley has also worked for Bernie Sanders on certain issues, for example. It's that whole alliance, that right-left alliance where Pat Buchanan's Mercedes runs right into Ralph Nader's bicycle, and that's why Elizabeth Warren can somehow she's actually pretty good at forming coalitions. Josh Hawley way on the right, Elizabeth Warren way on the left. Eventually, politics is a circle, and they connect.
So there's something interesting. So she was tainted with her Native American gate.
Yeah.
But why would that other politicians do far worse things? They get tainted with much more onerous labels, and they don't let that bother them. Why can't she overcome that? Yeah, I did that. So what? I'm going to do what you want. I'm going to help you out. You can just overlook that or not. Why is it that some small stuff sticks to some people and not to others? Just because they just don't let it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's interesting. It reminds me of a couple of things. It's like, remember, it's like if you remember, for example, Gary Hart. What's the first thing you think of when you think of Gary Hart?
That indiscretion with the woman on the
monkey
boat.
business.
Yeah.
All he's done in his career. That was a part of it. But in his obituary, that's what people are getting. That's the one thing people are going to remember. Former Lieutenant Governor Jane Swift in Massachusetts. She took a helicopter to babysit her children on the western part of the state. It was a state-run helicopter. When you say Jane Swift, people remember that. There are certain things that just absolutely stick to people. Then there are folks like Ronald Reagan, who Patricia Schroeder, who recently died, the former congressman from Colorado, said he was Teflon because people, essentially this stuff would not stick to him. So some things do stick to people, some things do not. In Elizabeth Warren's case, the way she handled it, though, she said essentially that she still contends to this day, that she believes, because of what her family lore had told her, that she had Native American heritage. And there are people in Oklahoma who really do believe that they have Native American heritage. Potentially, is it 116th, 164th, maybe? But the fact of the matter is, she did say that, and there is a case that she potentially believed it. Now, was she hyperbolic in terms of putting it on her resume? probably.
Well,
but
yeah, her real problem was
how she promoted
trying to
it.
use that to get a job when, clearly the label of minority is intended to help people who appear to be minorities and have been kept out of the gold rush because of it. And she's doesn't appear to have been kept back by her 1/16th, even if it were 1/16th.
Yeah.
She shouldn't be using that as a crutch to get a gig, in other words.
But the question is it should it be a death blow to her political?
No, yeah, it only should be if she allows it to be. She should. I have always maintained that guys like Gary Hart should just say, "Yep, I did it. My bad. Moving on," and just own it and not squirm and hide and try to prevaricate. Is that the word?
Yes, absolutely. Varigate works.
So just she should say, "God, that was a mistake. I was wrong, and I apologize. And I learned my lesson, and I'm moving on." Just say that.
And you say mistakes were made, and there certainly are a litany of politicians who have done that, who have had a second life. Look at Mark Stanford. Remember Mark Stanford, the governor of South Carolina, who his staff didn't know where he was. He was on the Appalachian Trail. It turns out he was having an affair. He comes back, he does a mea culpa, and he wins a seat in Congress in the state of South Carolina. There are certainly examples of politicians. Certainly, Bill Clinton is another one. Bill Clinton originally said, "I did not have sexual relationship with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." Eventually, 6 months later, he essentially spoke to American people, and he said that I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky. That was not appropriate. He left with a 66% job approval, the highest of any president, the highest in the history of polling. Ronald Reagan essentially said that yes, hostages were traded. While he said that he didn't know about it, he did admit that it essentially happened. He left with a 65% job approval rating. But Elizabeth Warren, it's interesting because it was really a barrage against her, and Donald Trump certainly contributed to this. They would use this, the talk radio show host Howie Carr, for example, spoke at a rally in New Hampshire and started immediately making fun of her, calling her, she called him up, she's going like this and pretending that she's an Indian. People would be dressing up as Indians at a rally to try to make fun of her about that. So as a result, it just stuck to her, and it became emblematic, I think, of people. What people's view is of somebody who is, I guess you make this a view of somebody who's kind of a limousine liberal, if you want. And that's one of the conservatives' caricature, and they make Elizabeth Warren as a limousine liberal, and they make it the case that, well, she talks about minorities, but then here she is, taking advantage of pretending that she was a Native American. It did not necessarily destroy her political career. She was still elected to the United States Senate over Scott Brown, a very formidable candidate. She was still reelected overwhelmingly. But when she ran for president, I think that there were some on the left. It was between her and Bernie Sanders. They saw Bernie Sanders as kind of the real deal, and they saw her as somebody who was more or less somebody who would prevaricate.
What about now? What about her brand? No hope. She's just doomed to be in the Senate forever,
yeah.
which is not a terrible gig.
No, not at all. That's why you wonder someone like Kamala Harris. As soon as she gets elected, she's senator from California, the biggest state in the entire country. 4 years later, she starts running for president. You say, what's wrong with being a senator from California? Right. But Elizabeth Warren, I don't think she'll ever recover from a presidential campaign, particularly in her own state of Massachusetts. Joe Biden did not spend one day campaigning in Massachusetts. Didn't spend any money here. He won the state of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren's home state. Bernie Sanders came in second place. This is her home state. Now, that being said, she's a national figure. And as a national figure, as somebody I think a lot of people in Massachusetts, by the way, see her more as a national figure than a state figure. They don't see her necessarily as kind of somebody who focuses on parochial issues, which is fine. And I think that she can actually make perhaps more of a name for herself in the Senate. Ted Kennedy, for example, up until he ran for president in 1980, everything was based on that presidential campaign. And then once he was kind of liberated from that. He was able to work across the aisle, and he didn't always have to worry about what it was going to be for his presidential campaign. So I think Elizabeth Warren is probably the same way. And she has announced this week, by the way, that she will be seeking re-election in 2024.
Okay, come full circle back around to Chris Christie. Might he be attractive to the Republicans who feel that Trump is ruining their party? I mean, that may be the majority of Republicans, but certainly enough of them so that they'd like to move on. And this guy, Trump, they feel is dragging them down. maybe Chris Christie is the only guy who can go up there, and Marco Rubio, the guy. And you can't Marco Rubio him, but at least you could stand up to him.
Yeah, but I think other candidates will stand up to him as well, and I think they're preparing for that line.
You think they're able to? Do you think they really have the ability to? Who has the ability to? Pompeo?
I don't know about Pompeo. I don't know if Pompeo necessarily would have that ability. I can see Donald Trump saying, you were an obscure congressman from Kansas. You were an ineffective congressman. I was nice to you. I made you Secretary of State. And I can see him absolutely destroying Mike Pompeo, just like I can see him doing the same with Ron DeSantis. He said, Ron, he said, you were running for governor. You were the underdog. Adam Putnam was supposed to win that race. And you came to me crying. You cried. You said, please, Donald, please, please, please. And I said, oh, all right. I don't know you, but I'm going to support you. Then you become governor of Florida. And then you become an ineffective, mediocre governor of Florida. And now here you are running. There are other people he can go after. Chris Christie. I know the line he can use. He can say you left. He can say you left with a 19% job approval rating in the state of New Jersey. The people in the state of New Jersey don't like you. You can never get elected dog catcher there. And he can say you hitched your wagon to me. You said I want to be vice president. Please, please, please. I didn't pick you, and now you're jealous. And now you're running. And then Chris Christie, what's his comeback? His comeback will be essentially, in the last election, we should have won. We should have won the House. We should have won by 45 seats. Instead, we have a very, very slim majority, and that's because of you. That's because you're such a divisive figure. But it's just going to be politics back and forth, and that's essentially what's going to be. Chris Christie could not take down Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election, but I don't think he's going to be the alternative necessarily to Donald Trump. I think his time is probably over. 2012, if he had run, I think he would have garnered the nomination. But there's going to be a litany of other candidates, and maybe he somehow can catch fire. But I'll say this: so the people, do you know how much in the last election, what percentage of Republicans supported Donald Trump, registered Republicans? In the
let me guess. 71.
No.
I give up.
94.
Whoa.
What does that show? It shows, I don't care who the Republican standard bearer is in the general election, who the Democratic standard bearer is. Generally speaking, the greatest indicator of how somebody is going to vote is now their political party. There's very little split ticket voting. There's where somebody votes, I'm going to vote for a presidential candidate who's a Republican, then I'll vote for a senator who's a Democrat. There are only 3 Democrats right now who represent states where Donald Trump won. That's Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. And interestingly, all 3 of them are up for re-election this time around. So you just have this dearth of people voting for one candidate for one, split ticket voting, if you will. So essentially, no matter who, when it comes to the presidential election, whether it's DeSantis, whether it's Donald Trump, it's Asa Hutchinson, no matter who it is versus Joe Biden, my guess is 94% of Republicans are going to vote for the Republican nominee. 94% of Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic nominee. Independent-leaning Democrats are going to vote for Biden. Independent-leaning Republicans will vote for the Republican. And there's about 10% that are truly persuadable voters. 10% truly persuadable voters in the electorate, and they are a very small contingent.
However, that election before, they knew that Donald was going to lose. Now he's more known as a person who's not going to win for him. Also, that was before January 6th. And
yes.
there may be a few who do have a beef with someone who tried to overthrow the government. Not many, but a few. So are you going to maintain that you're going to get that 94% again?
No, he's not going to get 94% in the general, but I can definitely see him getting, so if Donald Trump's a nominee, I think he's definitely going to be well over 80.
Okay.
Even if it's reluctant, they're going to vote for they're going to vote for assuming Donald Trump doesn't, by the way, evacuate the party and run as a third party candidate, or an independent candidate, but assuming he actually runs, it is kind of as someone says, it's an us versus them mentality, and people are going to be reluctantly. There are plenty of Republicans who potentially, this happened last time around too. They don't like him personally. They don't like him. They don't like his values, but he's a Republican. He does what they want him to do, so they'll hold their nose and they'll vote for him.
Okay. So obviously we have to address the news of the
yes.
Donald Trump indictment. Are you surprised that it actually happened?
No, I think a grand jury can indict just about anybody for just about any offense. So I would have been befuddled if they had not indicted him.
Yeah. But then there's a whole people are very hesitant for some reason to indict a former president.
Yeah,
I
because
don't really get why that's such a big deal. Even if regardless of which side it's on, I don't see why it's such a big deal to indict a former president. Why is that such a earth-shattering thing?
well, I think just because it's because of the national coverage it's going to get. Some people might be a little bit solicitous that there's going to be potentially riots in the streets. And imagine if you're in the jury pool and you're saying, "Wow, I could effectuate this outcome. I could have a pan essentially, even inadvertently, in 2024 if this guy wins the nomination, if this guy becomes president." So that's what I think it is. And I think the other thing is, just the spectacle of it. You've seen this certainly in other countries, in Israel, for example, with Bibi Netanyahu. Just imagine the spectacle if Donald Trump is actually he's indicted now, but if he's actually convicted, and you actually have the possibility of a president going to the penitentiary with Secret Service agents and everything else. So I can see people saying, as anybody who's in a jury pool in the first place, if you get a case, you say, I potentially could change the life of somebody. This guy's in charge for armed robbery. Well, what if this guy really didn't do it? What if he did? It's
the
just
same with anybody though.
it's a lot of pressure for anybody, even for a low level misdemeanor crime. Never let for a misdemeanor for somebody that no one's ever heard of. Never mind somebody who's the president of the United States or former president.
Who used to be the president, but maybe I'm weird. That wouldn't affect me. He's a former president. So what? Okay. And not just because it's Trump. Anybody on either side, there's bad apples on both sides. Okay. Next is as I understand it, the indictment is 30 counts.
Yes.
And we're talking about, there's a lot of talk about Stormy Daniels, the payment, and what laws that might be related to that, broken related to that. But it's 30 counts. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand how you get 30 counts out of just that. I'm wondering if there's some other things in there, like potential. Remember, they were looking at financial stuff like inflating the value of this to get better deals on loans. Yeah. I wonder if some of that stuff. I don't know if you can combine the indictments on completely different things. Maybe you can. So we'll see.
And I will say this though: it's not actually just paying paying hush money to Stormy Daniels in and of itself. It's not a crime. If that's a loan, it may be unethical, but from a legal standpoint, that's not. It's more the way you hide it. It's more the way it's more the fraud. From the banking point of view, that's what the essential indictment is. It's not simply. It's just like you can have an affair with somebody. There's nothing illegal about that. But then if you're under oath and they ask you, did you have an affair with somebody? And you say, no, I didn't.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Well, that was when he said that.
That was not under oath. I know
that was not under oath, but that was actually the day it was interesting when he said that. This was Bill Clinton he's referring to in 1998, and this was the day before. This is 3 days after after the Monica Lewinsky story broke on the Drudge Report, and everyone's talking about. He has a State of the Union address the next day, just happened by coincidence, and there was a child care event. And Al Gore, the vice president, was supposed to be there to promote funding for childcare. And Bill Clinton, his aide, said, no, we want to be here for that instead. So Bill Clinton actually comes up and he actually gives a 15-minute speech, very good, about the need for childcare. And then at the end of that, he says, and finally, I'd like to say something to the American people. I want you to listen to me because I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anyone to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you. And then people said, wow, and then the question is, was he technically telling the truth? That he did not have sexual relations? Well, in his first interview, on the day when the story broke, he was interviewed by Jim Lehrer, and he asked him the question. He said, there is no sexual relationship, which is technically true because at that time there was not a sexual relationship. So it really gets into the legalese, but basically when he did give his mea culpa, he said, I did have a sexual relationship with Miss Lewinsky. So he did give kind of a mea culpa, but under a very legalistic definition. And Dick Morris, the former Clinton aide, supposedly said that Bill Clinton called him up the day that this was all broke and said, I did do something, but it's not essentially what people are making it out. So maybe he had a different perception of what sexual relations actually is from a legalistic standpoint. I don't know.
It's so weird. Like, first, why would you do that? You know, your president. And then he could have just, once again, he could have just, he would have been better off if he just said, yeah, mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. I apologize to my wife. She looks up at him adoringly. Move on.
Yeah, that would, if he had done that at that time, remember what saved Bill Clinton was the fact that American people cared more about the Dow Jones than Paula Jones, and he had a 63% job approval rating, and after Monica Lewinsky broke, it went up to 78% because the economy was rolling. It was essentially peace and prosperity. Whether they liked Bill Clinton or not, people liked what was in their 401ks, and they did not want to get rid of him. And that's what the Republicans essentially. The Republicans really, it was a huge kerfuffle and a huge mistake on the part of the Republicans, I think, politically, to keep going after him. Because what happened is in the 1998 midterm elections, for the first time since 1820, with James Monroe, a political party actually picked up seats in the 6th year of their presidency. And that was in part because of the economy. And also, it was essentially, I think, retribution, if you will, against the Republicans for the way they went, for all the time they spent going after the impeachment. People said, yes, Bill Clinton perjured himself. But he perjured himself. Under oath, he said that he did not have a sexual relationship. But this was in a civil trial, and it was on a tangentially related issue. And the whole Whitewater thing was supposed to be about a land deal in Arkansas. But all of a sudden, Kenneth Starr brings it over to this other issue. And the reason I bring up Kenneth Starr is the way that Donald Trump is now going after the district attorney Bragg in New York. I think potentially when Bill Clinton and all of his coefficients went after Kenneth Starr, it became very effective, and Kenneth Starr became very unpopular to the point that he wanted to leave. Midterm. The Republicans are going to do the exact same thing. They're going to say essentially this is a political witch hunt. They're going to say this is a Democratic district attorney. They're going to say he's been weak on crime. He's trying to get his political bona fides. He's trying to win for re-election. He wants to become governor someday. Just like the Democrats did to Ken Starr. This guy's a Republican. He was a Solicitor General under George H.W. Bush, and they say essentially, he's somebody that he's somebody who's an overzealous prosecutor. And he just wants to go after. He just wants to go after Bill Clinton for his own resume, his own own sense of a moral code, and it really worked because Kenneth Starr became extremely unpopular in the country.
A couple things. I think that Alvin Bragg knows, he went into this with his eyes open, knowing what was going to happen. Maybe Ken Starr didn't. So, and I ask him, what do you do if in fact there are crimes committed financially regarding misstating of value to get deals on loans? If there are these crimes, what do you do? Are you supposed to just go, but I'm afraid. I gotta let him go. I'm afraid that Trump's people will physically harm me. I'm afraid he's going to be mean to me. And if you're the prosecutor, what do you do?
Well,
nothing. Do you just do nothing because you're afraid? I
think when you do the jury pool, and I think if somebody wants to get out of the jury pool, that's what you essentially say. You said no. Either you say on the one hand, you say, they say that you, and this is going to be interesting because everyone has an opinion on Donald Trump. Even people that are low with propensity voters that have very peripheral interest in politics. When you say the word Donald Trump, almost everybody has an opinion of him. So the question is, how does he get a fair jury, first of all, on his side, and on the other side, how do you get somebody that's completely neutral or that can completely kind of compartmentalize whatever they personally think of Donald Trump with whether he's innocent or guilty? And my guess is a lot of people in that are going to say when they're interviewed, and they're going to ask them questions. They're going to say, "Do you like Donald Trump?" A lot of people are going to say, "I love Donald Trump," even if they don't, just so they can get off of the jury pool. But it's going to be interesting who's actually on there, and obviously those people have to be very, those people have to be pretty empowered to get on that to make that decision, because there's always a possibility there could be death threats. You don't know what's going to happen after you make your decision.
The upside is, can you write a book on your experience on the jury in that case?
That's a good question.
Okay, so this is pretty.
Why you can't? You're no longer on the jury.
Yeah. So there's that. You can make some money off it.
That's definitely an advantage. You guys take notes as you go.
Like that woman who was impaneled in the grand jury to decide if the grand jury should indict. The one that kind of.
Yeah, and then
Charlie flapped her.
And then she went to the media. Yeah,
flapped her jaw. She probably made a few grand off that. She
Oh,
had to.
absolutely, absolutely. I guess if you're looking at and you have a good business advisor, that's probably a pretty good thing if you can somehow if you can somehow monetize this.
How much would you guess she made? 100 grand?
I
That's
would
a
say,
huge,
I
a
would say
huge
probably a
story.
little more, but that would make sense. About 100 grand, yeah.
All right. So the next thing is, and I'm just trying to look at this strategically. Um, there are folks that say indictment will now help Donald Trump politically. I'm going to say that I used to think that, and now I don't think so,
Interesting.
because it's everybody's cast in stone where you are on Donald Trump. Nobody's going to change their mind. His rabid fans will still be rabid. It will help him raise some money,
Yep.
but will it help? Will it get him votes? Anybody who's going to vote for him is already going to vote for him. Anybody not going to vote for him is already not going to vote for him. That's my new thing. And if you there are, what do you think on that?
I think it's a net negative to the respect that there are going to be some voters who potentially like Donald Trump's policies and are kind of blasé, if you will, on Donald Trump personally. They might look at this and they might say, well, he has all this baggage. If we just from a strategic standpoint, he may even be my favorite choice, but if we give this guy the nomination, you're essentially giving the Democrats ammunition. So maybe we need somebody who's closer to Donald Trump's policies without being Donald Trump. And that's the case where somebody else gets on there and says, I'm an America First conservative, but I would not. I certainly would never be. You certainly would never hear me in the same phrase as Hutch Money with a porn star or something to that effect. And then they're going to vote for somebody else. And that's my guess. I think it's probably a net negative. Now, obviously, from a financial standpoint, and also from a unity standpoint, you have this really odd situation of Republicans who are opponents of Donald Trump having to now talk about how they think this is overzealous prosecutor and how this is un-American and everything else. So they're kind of rallying around the flag, if you will. They're rallying to Donald Trump. It reminds me a little bit of the hostage crisis when essentially when the hostages were captured, and folks that were running in the Democratic primary and the Republican primary all of a sudden had to say, we support Jimmy Carter because that's the only potential scenario that you can have. And as a result, Jimmy Carter, he was losing miserably to Ted Kennedy. He comes back and he ekes out a victory over Ted Kennedy in part, inadvertently, I think, because of the hostage crisis. So maybe there will be a rally around the flag effect in that respect. But I think on balance, it will be a net negative.
Okay, the next thing is, what are the odds that he'll beat the raps, multiple raps? And I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't figure that the prosecutor is going to bring a case unless they're pretty darn sure they can nail it down. For one, they do have a template in Michael Cohen.
Yep.
All the circumstances that convicted Michael Cohen are exactly the same, only they apply to the mastermind of the thing rather than the errand boy. It's so much of it's really been adjudicated. Adjudicated one time. Yeah, I guess guilty. It's like the whole package of circumstances. They are exactly the same. There is precedent set that this exact set of circumstances will produce a guilty verdict.
Well,
so there's that.
It's interesting, and if I was a moderator of a panel on a presidential debate, I would ask this question to other Republicans. So you've said in the past, and almost every Republican except Lynn Cheney that's potentially running for president has basically said this. Essentially, I guess Chris Christie really hasn't said this, but essentially you said that you're against the idea of Donald Trump being indicted, whatever you said, an abomination, whatever you said it was. So if you become president and Donald Trump is convicted, would you consider pardoning him? And if they want to hold to their convictions, they would probably say, yes, I think this was, I think this is abhorrent what happened here. So therefore, I would essentially, when I get in there, I would pardon Donald Trump. It's interesting. You've seen George H.W. Bush pardon some people who were involved in Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton pardoned Susan McDougal, who was involved in Whitewater. And they were both very vociferously against those investigations against the prosecutor. So if Ron DeSantis becomes president on his first day, if Trump's convicted, would you issue him a pardon?
So, but isn't this something that's not pardonable by a federal?
The state. It's going to be right. The state level. But I would say more of a all-encompassing question. I would say, would you
I think-
favor a pardon for him? But you're right. There's a difference between a
All right.
state and a federal level, and I guess he couldn't technically do it from a.
So next, my theory is this: that for some reason, whether it was a fear that it would help Donald Trump, or that the country would be torn apart by violence, or that it's just so unprecedented to indict a president, things have been dragging in Atlanta and in the Mar-a-Lago documents and in the 9/11. Nobody wanted to be the person that brought an indictment, first person against a former president. But now that barrier has been broken, do you think perhaps it will be easier for them to go ahead and charge him with things in these other cases?
It's interesting because I think that even folks like Adam Schiff, who was on the Judiciary Committee, very much vociferous advocate of impeachment, he's very much saying that Merrick Garland needs to kind of show his hand and needs to really go after Trump. He needs to display an indictment. I think it's some Democrats, I think what their fear is that the Stormy Daniels case is the weakest case and it's a misdemeanor case, and people are going to look at it and they're going to say, just like with Bill Clinton and the case, yeah, he perjured himself. Yes, it was under oath, but is this really worth impeaching over? Whereas if you come to the issue of the Mar-a-Lago documents, if you come to the issue of potentially trying to overturn the election by asking the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia to find votes for him, that's something that the American people will view and discuss, whereas this is something they potentially might view as a misdemeanor. So in that respect, it actually could be a net negative. It could be like Donald Trump saying essentially, this is an all-encompassing witch hunt, and they found something so kind of innocuous or something to that effect. So I can totally see that kind of coming after him. I can see that in that respect.
So do you think it might be easier for them to indict on all these other things now that this is no longer a novel idea?
From a political standpoint, yes, because I don't know if they really have that much of a connection. I doubt that Merrick Garland is really necessarily paying attention. I think once a grand jury generally takes up a case, I think the thought process is, unless barring a cataclysm, the person will be indicted. Indicting is not a hard thing to do.
Right.
All you're saying is you just have 12 of 23 jurors essentially saying, yeah, there's enough evidence there to have a case to go for a conviction. That's all.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, if talk about a witch hunt, there are a couple kinds of witch hunts. There's political witch hunt because we want to bring this person down, because we want our team to be in power. But there's another one. There's just kind of a revenge witch hunt because a person has just been so onerous. It's like, he antagonizes everybody so much that people are bound to not let stuff go. If he'd been a different guy and not operate the way he did, he wouldn't have so much animus and people remembering and willing to spend the time, the effort, and the money to exact revenge. And you might have to expect some of this kind of revenge if you act that way. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and
if
also
there'd been somebody else that didn't operate that way, they might have let it go.
It would I guess it would have to be somebody who's extremely popular and who has bipartisan appeal. I guess that would be Bill Clinton, but they would not let that one go. That's certainly at least from a congressional standpoint. He was not indicted. He was not actually indicted over, for example, Monica Lewinsky over Whitewater, but certainly from a political standpoint, there were Whitewater investigations. Alphonse D'Amato of New York led an investigation on Whitewater, and eventually this led to Monica Lewinsky, and he was certainly impeached but not convicted. But it certainly never went to actual court. I think in the case of Richard Nixon, who was very divisive and left with a 24% job approval rating, had Gerald Ford not pardoned him after Nixon egressed from office, and that were actually to go to trial, I think even though Richard Nixon had no political career after that, I think there would be many people who still have an absolute vituperation, if you will, toward Richard Nixon. And I think if he were indicted and convicted, there would be a lot of people that would be very happy, probably certainly many Democrats, not necessarily because of his policies, but more because of him and because they see it as kind of a culture war against Richard Nixon. In the case of Donald Trump, very similar. he certainly brings out, on the one hand, he brings out people that absolutely die for him, that view this, see there's no God but Donald Trump. On the one hand, there are people that view him as kind of the Antichrist. So there's very little kind of in between. And that's why they're, if he does win the nomination, there are going to be very few actual persuadable voters.
And let's take the documents thing in a related situation. You know, if he'd said, "Oh, right, you mean I'm not supposed to take these documents? Ah, here you go," and he made sure that they were all. But instead, he gives the finger to the law. He gives.
Well, that helps him with the space.
Okay, but he's giving the finger to the law. You kind of got to expect the law. If you didn't act that way, maybe they'd let you slide, but you did act that way. You gave the finger to the cop.
Well, that's where there's an inherent contradiction here, because on the one hand, you hear back the blue, you hear all lives matter. And then on the other hand, when it comes to, when certainly for somebody who talks about law and order, if he was not somebody who was kind of who advocated the policies of law and order, then maybe he would not be necessarily seen as a hypocrite here. But there's obviously, just like the human being, we have multiplicities and motivations, right, and there's a cognitive dissonance here. And but I think that when he goes after, if he goes after the FBI, by the way, you wonder how much of this, and I don't know if this is direct connection, but all the intelligence agencies, and we had all the intelligence agencies missed Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence agencies missed that. So if I were Donald Trump, I'll be making this case, because he was somebody who was, at least after the war, very much against it and took on Jeb Bush. But he can say, these people took us into war based on false pretenses, saying there are weapons of mass destruction. There are none. Now they're essentially trying to go after me. And that's where you can go after the deep state. And that's actually a case that I think can consolidate support from the right and the left.
Okay, back to witch hunt. I got to say that overall, it's not the pure political witch hunt that he makes out to be. It's a revenge hunt, because you were such a dick at every step of the way. It's I don't want to say, I don't exactly mean revenge. It's you just can't overlook it. You were so nasty and continue to be so nasty and so mean that you won't let us overlook this stuff. You gave the finger to the government on the documents. You just boldly called up and said, "Give me votes." You're sticking your thumb in the eye of the law, and so I don't think it's necessarily a political witch hunt. It's just, dude, you forced us to do this by your behavior. Okay. Finally, there's an element of OJ and Capone here. Like, people, it's pretty clear that, pretty clear to many, let me rephrase that. Many feel that OJ was guilty. But he didn't go to jail for that. He went to jail for stealing some of his own stuff. Yep. Like, they really threw the book at him for that. There's an element of that here. There's an element of the Capone thing. They couldn't get Capone on the back.
Tax evasion, yeah.
So they couldn't get Trump, at least yet, on an alleged attempt to overthrow the government. They didn't get him yet on, I'll just say that. So they're getting him on what they can get him on. You wonder, well, why are they making such a big deal out of this payoff thing? Well, it's because of that. It's the same reason that they made such a big deal out of OJ trying to steal back his sports memorabilia. It's because, we're kind of, we kind of know, everybody kind of believes that you did this, and so we couldn't get you that way, we'll get you this way. Do you think there's an element of that?
No, I don't think that's the flagship reason. I think that it's not necessarily that people are looking at this from an equitable standpoint. I think it's more they're looking at it whether in some respects, and I think I'm talking about the American people, not the prosecutors, it's whether you like Donald Trump or you don't like Donald Trump. I know of very few people that like Donald Trump, but think he should go to jail, or on the other side, people that do not like Donald Trump, but you know what, say this is all the witch hunt. I think he's completely innocent. Now, obviously, people have, and it's somewhere in the hippocampus, I guess, but people have in their brains something where they immediately gravitate toward people and against others, and obviously some of that is ideology. But there are very few liberals that I think say, well, I really just like the guy, I hate the guy, but he's completely innocent, and very few conservatives that are saying, well, I think he's guilty, but I really, really like this guy. So people's voices here are not necessarily going to change. I don't think anyone was saying really. I don't think there are many people that are kind of just fair like that are saying, or prosecutors for that matter, saying, well, if you had done it a different way, maybe we would have let you slide. I think people are just so vociferous on both sides. He's just such.
Do you think that's political, or do you think that they're vociferous because of his behavior and the way he went about it?
That's a good question. The question is, if it was somebody who had Donald Trump's policies, and actually some of them are frankly progressive. I mean, on trade, on non-intervention, for example, on wanting to. I mean, look at what he's going after Ron DeSantis for. When Ron DeSantis was in Congress, Ron DeSantis, he said, according to Trump, wanted to truncate Social Security and Medicare, and he said, I'm never going to do that. So it's not that he's necessarily this far right conservative. A lot of it, you're right, is probably more or less the personality, and also just like Nixon, by the way. Nixon established the EPA. Nixon established relations with China. Nixon signed a non-proliferation pact, the SALT Treaty, strategic arms limitations with the Soviet Union. He increased a lot of the Great Society, supported affirmative action. So he was not necessarily a Jesse Helms far-right conservative, but he was a polarizing figure because he would go after the hippies. He would call them bums, for example. He was somebody. So as a result of that, people on the left and even in the center started to view him, I think, more as a polarizing figure, or somebody that they may think is more conservative than he actually is. So there is, I think, a lot of validity to the point that a lot of it is just that a lot of it is just Donald Trump's behavior, not necessarily his ideological predisposition.
Yeah. So here's the deal with me. It's really not political. I've tested myself on this. Could be somebody from either side. But I'm a guy who is irritated when rich people get away with stuff. If I park I get parking tickets. I have to pay them. If I break the law, I definitely get caught every time. If I did the stuff that the president is alleged to have done, I would completely be punished for it. I can't afford the lawyers, etc. I just don't like this double standard for rich people and powerful people. They get away with stuff all the time. So, I mean, that's kind of what is the deciding factor for me. I want people who stick their eye in the thumb of the law to pay, because I would have to pay. That's it. If I lied straight up to whoever is the president is alleged to have lied about having, I don't have any more documents now, I'd be in super trouble. I would get. So I want the law to be applied equally. I know it doesn't. Equal justice under the law. Nice idea, but it's a fantasy. But wherever I do see an opportunity to make a Bernie Madoff go to jail or something like that, I was like, yeah, man, I want that to happen. That's just me. I just want things to be fair. And if Trump was Clinton or whomever, I would want the same thing. There you go.
That is interesting, because that is a very equitable. I think that's almost the 10% of the country that's actually persuadable one way or the other, that's not looking at this through an ideological prism, an ideological lens, if you will. I don't think most people necessarily think of that way. I think it's something that it could be potentially, that would actually be a good talking point for Donald Trump's detractors, in terms of saying whatever you think about Donald Trump, I support equal justice under the law. And if I were caught doing what Donald Trump did, essentially, I would be indicted and I would be convicted before you can say Jack Robinson. So that is very interesting.
And there's another thing.
Yeah.
There are allegations about cheating at golf. That doesn't mean much to a lot of people, I guess. I hate that. That if that were to be true, that would be a deal breaker for me. I'm not going to send him to
Really?
jail. As far as voting for somebody, I'll find another candidate. Yeah,
But
that's
everybody has. But the other thing is, everybody has fatal flaw. Every candidate has fatal flaws, and sometimes, when you're dealing with human beings, very few are perfect. None of them are perfect. So you have to kind of, in some respects, pick the lesser of two evils, or the lesser of seven evils, lesser of 17 evils, and you have to look at everybody's
right.
both their assets and their liabilities. So potentially, the fact that someone might cheat in golf will certainly be a liability, but is that as big of a liability
For
if, for
me,
example, they've embezzled? If, for example, another guy is alleged to have embezzled money from a company, for example.
also, if I were a small business person that was forced to play by the rules, as small business persons are, I would be livid that other business persons cheated. If it had been proven that
Or a
somebody
community bank.
cheated to get ahead, doing things that I would be thrown in jail for, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't vote for the dude. I would find another conservative. So that's me. And I know that other people just overlook everything because they think he's the guy that can do what I want. But we'll see. He is getting. Who's the dude that was tied down by a bunch of Lilliputians? There was some big monstery type of individual who was tied down by a bunch of very small people. That's kind of what's going on here.
That's
What's the story of the Lilliputians? I'll have to look that up.
that is interesting, and I think that is actually a great case for the Democrats to make. Say essentially that we're going after the rich and the powerful.
Gulliver.
Okay.
That was this Will Lyon says Gulliver.
Gulliver's Travels.
I guess I don't know, but I guess Gulliver was big and kind of a Paul Bunyan kind of thing.
A Leviathan.
Yeah, and he was dragged down by a lot of little people. Okay, so there you go. That's about an hour. This is a good one. Again, your book is awesome. People should buy it way before Christmas.
Oh yes, categorically.
Categorically. I know I was opinionated today.
No,
But,
that's great.
I thought it through. I was surprised by the indictment because I'm one of the people that have been Muellerized. They're like,
Yep.
oh, Mueller report, blah, 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 blah. And nothing. To me, it just became apparent that we had reached a stage where rich and powerful do what they want with impunity. And, well, Trump might beat the rap. And if so, maybe he should. I mean, if the jurors look at the evidence and find out he didn't do what he's accused of, okay, fine. That's fine. But at least the dude had to sit down and get judged, which was something that hadn't been happening before.
If I was on another case, I would make, if I was on terms of the Democrats, they could say that essentially Donald Trump getting off would constitute that the country is becoming an oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy few, where people like Donald Trump can essentially get off because they have good lawyers. And as you say, compare him to other celebrities that have potentially gotten off. That might actually be a case that folks on the left and the center will make. But in the end of the day, politically, in terms of in the general election, if Trump wins the nomination, Republicans are still going to vote for Donald Trump. Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic nominee, and there's going to be very few actual persuadable voters. Donald Trump is not Gerald Ford. He's not somebody that potentially Americans can kind of go either way on. He's somebody that Americans, no matter how low propensity voters or interest they have in politics, when you mention the word Donald Trump, most people have an immediate visceral reaction. Most people are not going to say, oh yeah, and then kind of look at it intellectually. Most people are just immediate reaction, and that's how divisive and polarizing of a lightning rod he is.
By the way, I think watching the reaction to the indictment might be telling. If there are massive protests around, then that would say one thing, and if there are not, that would also speak volumes. Have you seen any massive protests yet?
No, not massive. Very few people.
Yeah.
So far, but I mean, this is obviously we're in the inchoate process now, and imagine if there was actually a conviction. then I think you're going to see a lot. You might see potentially some unrest. Will it be how big an elephantine will it be? I don't know.
I think I am not an expert, but I just am lucky and write a lot. In the case of a conviction, I do not think you're going to see these big protests materialize.
Right.
That is the press doing what the press does and striking the fear in you so you watch the press. I think that it's like, oh, okay, no surprise. And it's going to be a whole lot of nothing. A few people out in front of Mar-a-Lago with the flags and a few people in Wyoming, and that's it. And there might be the occasional mentally ill person who acts as an individual and does something terrible. Yeah, that is terrible. That's what I expect. So that's an hour there, Rich.
I was just thinking of one other thing. I was just thinking of a comparison. Remember Rod Blagojevich?
Yes.
The governor of Illinois?
Yeah.
Well, when he was governor for
he tried to sell off Obama's seat.
Well, basically, yes, he tried to sell his seat, basically said this was effing golden, and he got caught. Essentially, he was somebody who became very unpopular, had a job approval of about 15%. When he was essentially impeached and then convicted just about unanimously in the Illinois General Assembly, essentially there were about 7 people that came to his house and talked about how they supported him, and he basically got out there and said, well, basically they're going after me because I cut taxes. But you know what, at the end of the day, Blagojevich was not somebody that really had a lot of vociferous people who were going to die for Rod Blagojevich.
Right.
And then what happens later on in life, he goes on Celebrity Apprentice, Donald Trump fires him, and then Donald Trump pardons him.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? He pardoned Rod Blagojevich, and then Blagojevich became a Democrat for Trump.
Oh, okay. That's another day. What do you want to do next time? Do you want to go through the Democratic field, or maybe something will pop up between now and then?
Yeah, between Joe Biden and Marianne Williamson. That's what it is so far. And right now, I think that Marianne Williamson should probably try to challenge Joe Biden to about 10 Lincoln-style Douglas debates, and then Joe Biden's probably going to, through his spokesperson, say that he's politely decline, and then Marianne Williamson will probably get about 10% of the vote.
Right. A big knock on Joe Biden is, I don't know, his age. I'm surprised that Democrats would be so ageist, because that's not a. You would think that liberals, who are rightfully very concerned about racism and sexism, would also be concerned about ageism, which is a significant thing because you cannot help how old you are.
Well, very few people are actually. I haven't heard any actual Democrat politician anywhere go after Joe Biden because of his age. Most of them, and including ones who potentially, like Governor Cooper of North Carolina, who potentially could run if Joe Biden does not run, are saying, I support Joe Biden for president. That's why essentially even Bernie Sanders, everyone else, the field is basically, except for Marianne Williamson, who's kind of a gadfly, it's basically going to be cleared for Joe Biden. Now, what are they saying behind closed doors? I think many of them are. No one wants to go after him specifically about his age publicly, but I think obviously there are a lot of people that are saying potentially, why can't we have somebody who's 30 years younger?
Well, he's a proven winner, I guess, and it's a weird world out there trying to figure out what wins. And when you have an example of somebody that wins, I think he's kind of like an old boxer, like an old weary boxer who every once in a while gets off a really good hit and knocks some guy out.
Oh, yeah.
He's underestimated, and they talk about how he stumbles and mumbles, but every once in a while he'll rise up and stick it to somebody. It's pretty interesting to watch them underestimate him.
He's always been somebody who's a very efficacious speaker. I think that actually 1988, when he was thinking about running, remember that's when the Dukakis campaign, John Sassode found out that he had taken speeches purloined him from Neil Canuck, the prime minister of Great Britain, and then eventually he'd taken other things from Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and he had to drop out of the race. But if you listen to any of his speeches from that time period, he's one of the most effective speakers, I think. So he's not somebody like John Kerry or Mitt Romney, who's just very kind of staid and very much speaking in platitudes. He's somebody who can actually, when he does speak, and specifically you take away the fact that sometimes he stumbles over his words and he stutters a little bit. Sometimes when he's speaking without a script and he actually does, and he's giving a non-ideological speech, it does sound like he's actually talking directly with the person. Not, it's almost like Bill Clinton. You're talking with the person. You're not talking to the person. You're not talking at the person. When he talks about his father and how his father lost his job and talking about growing up and everything else and everything, Claremont, Delaware, everything else, can very much come off as somebody just kind of like a buddy, and that's why I think he was so popular, specifically with working class voters, because in part one of the problems they've had with some of their nominees is they're looked upon as patronizing, as people who kind of look down, if you will, toward their constituents. Bill Clinton, and just like Joe Biden, and I think Jimmy Carter to a certain respect, did not have that criticism, because people, when they listened to them talk, they did not think that these were kind of Ivy Leaguers that were looking down on people. And I think that's one of the fact that he's not seen as condescending is one of the major assets that Joe Biden certainly has with blue collar voters.
Well, this is sure as heck going to be an interesting presidential cycle. It's crazy. Okay, we need to save some for next time. So, Rich Rubino, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And it looks like we're back probably on the Friday schedule, because I am finally getting over COVID.
Sounds copacetic.
And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks,
Absolutely. Man. Thank you so much.
Okay. We're not done yet. Here we go. We're on.